Friends, very nice to see you again, or for you to join us. James, good to see you.
Nice to see you too, Ian, and Happy New Year to you.
And a happy new year to you too. You beat me to it. And of course, I've still got my Christmas decorations up, James, as I should I not?
Indeed, you should. Yes, we have several days to go before Christmas is over. Yes.
Indeed. I don't know. There must be something philosophical here about the fact that in our culture, we start so-called Christmas in the lead up, and then Christmas Day finishes Christmas. Whereas, of course, liturgically, we're waiting in Advent, and then we have Christmas Day, and then it's the Christmas season. Is it a lost battle?
I think it is in terms of the culture, but I think it's a great act of resistance on behalf of part of Christians to say waiting is good, and waiting in Scripture is always a good thing. So I'm quite passionate about waiting. So
okay, well, in that case, I shall keep my Christmas decorations up until 12th night.
Very good. I mean, deferred gratification is the essence of human fulfillment, according to M. Scott Peck, isn't it? So you know,
I'll take your word for it.
Apparently,
okay. James, we're in a dilemma here, aren't we, about what we're speaking about?
Yeah, we are.
Coming Sunday.
Yes, it's either you can either hold this Sunday as Epiphany, officially Epiphany moved as it were, or you can keep it as the baptism of Christ, the first Sunday of Epiphany.
Right.
So depending on which one you go for, that dictates the readings. And I think we've decided we're going to go for the baptism of Christ.
We are.
So
even though you're going to do something different.
We're going to do the Epiphany, but we could have gone the other way. It's just one of those years when it's not really very clear cut. So Matthew,
it makes it less clear cut because of the timing of Christmas being.
I think Sunday, so. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think if Epiphany was like on Wednesday, I think you'd be definitely doing the baptism of Christ on Sunday. But
yeah, great. Well, I've got my cup of tea in my special tea mug. So
very good.
Remind me of the passage then.
So we're on Matthew.
We're in year A, aren't we? So
we're year A. So we're still in Matthew, and we have Matthew's version of the baptism of Jesus, which is Matthew 3:13 to 17. So really a very short passage. And we've had the immediately preceding passage only a week or two ago, didn't we? In
Advent.
In Advent, yeah,
we did. Now, when I've written about this on the blog, I draw an analogy with, ironically, a thing called, this is going to be very confusing liturgically, a thing called Easter eggs in films. Are you familiar with the idea of Easter eggs in films?
Well, I wasn't so particularly familiar with them in films, but I am very conscious of them, which I think is where they originated, actually, in games, in video gaming, because my son told me about video game Easter eggs. So they were big there, and then I think they kind of caught on. I mean, they've always been there, I think, in films, but there's kind of quite a deliberate Easter egging that goes on in particularly in films that have many sequels,
which they are all doing now, and prequels and so on. And there's this crossover as well, isn't there, between video games now?
Yes, absolutely.
Films. So actually, some films now, our guys are watching the Witcher films, which are a film created out of the video game, I think.
Yeah.
So what are Easter eggs? I mean, I don't mean that liturgically or
no. I think, basically, I see them as kind of allusions to other films. So, I mean, like, for instance, I was watching It's a Wonderful Life, and I realized that actually there's an allusion in Back to the Future 2 to A Wonderful Life, where they show a scene where what life would be like had something not happened. They're shown an alternative timeline, and it's a very clear allusion.
Right.
And I think it's that it makes the audience go, oh, I know what's going on. I feel kind of on the inside track here, and I feel quite clever. So that's how I think that's how most of them seem to work, isn't it?
It is, and there's an interesting debate about when is an allusion and when is it not. I mean, how clear does it have to be? And of course, the other interesting dynamic is that it kind of creates insiders and outsiders.
Yeah,
because you've got to have known the original. I mean, I've terrible confession. I've never watched It's a Wonderful Life. It's the archetypal Christmas film, isn't it?
It is, and it's interesting you say that, because I only watched it 2 years ago for the very first time, and it's then that I noticed this allusion. And one of the interesting things I've noticed about the Easter egg allusions is that you get it the first time you watch a film. When you go back, you think, it's not as clear as I thought it was the first time round, which is a very odd experience, but it's been quite consistent for me. So there's an immediacy about it in a film, which is very interesting, that it seems to fade. Don't Don't know why
And
that
also,
is.
when you have that aha moment, you spot it. It's not just intellectual; it's actually an emotive feeling.
It is emotive, absolutely.
You go, oh!
Yeah,
You suddenly,
yeah,
great.
you do,
And I
definitely.
think they're called Easter eggs, aren't they? Because it's under the practice of, I think it's more traditional in Europe than it is in, on
Yeah,
continental Europe than it is in
yeah,
the UK,
yeah.
where you actually hide Easter eggs around the garden and children have to go.
That's right, absolutely.
Or where,
Yeah.
so they're kind of hidden there, but they're hidden with a view to them being spotted and being
So
found.
people know that. Yes, I mean, we do an Easter egg hunt in our churchyard at Easter.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, and you tend to find Easter eggs quite a lot of the rest of the year, actually, if you look carefully. But the children don't get all of them. But yeah,
Excellent.
yeah.
Now, the whole reason for saying that is because this is, again, typically we do comment quite often what a short reading this is. It's only 5 verses.
Yeah.
And as you say, it's the second half of this episode. So the link is below for the first half. The link back to the discussion we had in Advent. But the reason is that Matthew, in this short account, Matthew seems to be, well, okay, what is he doing? Is he deliberately hiding them? Are they there to be found? Is it just sort of a natural thing? But there seem to be lots of Easter eggs, as it were.
Yes.
This is really confusing. We're in the Christmas season. We're in Epiphany. Well, maybe it's Epiphany, and we're finding Easter eggs. That is, there's lots of these allusions to Old Testament episodes in this short reading.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think we've mentioned before that Matthew appears to be writing particularly for a Jewish audience. So they would have been clearer to a Jewish audience than they would, had it been Luke writing for a Gentile audience. It's not to say that Luke doesn't do this, but Matthew does it in a particularly intense way, and particularly in these few verses, I think, Ian, doesn't he? I mean, there are so many, which we will no doubt explore in a few minutes.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's turn to the text. So Matthew chapter 3, 13 to 17. I just noticed it's quite interesting that we begin with, so we've heard in the previous passage about John's baptism, he says, quickly scrolling back. And what is kind of interesting is that in John's baptism, he sees many Pharisees and Sadducees coming.
Yeah.
And, he's got this quite harsh language for them. You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath that is to come. And so there's a whole really interesting issue around the relationship between the coming of the kingdom, the breaking of the kingdom, and the whole question of judgment. And then John continues this theme of judgment by saying that, there's one coming after me who is mightier than I. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor and gallop his wheat into the barn. But the chaff he will burn with asbestos, unquenchable fire. So we explored all that. And then immediately we have, then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to John. Now, there's actually quite an interesting geographical dynamic to that, isn't there, in terms of
there is.
journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if Jesus has come from Galilee, he's come quite a long way down to the Jordan, to the point where John is baptizing, and it's a point in the Jordan. It's a geographical place, which of course is resonant with so much meaning for anybody who knows the Old Testament.
Yeah. So if we imagine, I haven't got a map here, but there's one on the related blog. But if you imagine, he's actually coming from Galilee in the north, but actually because John is on the far side of the Jordan. Now, I don't know for which way around I'm doing my map here, but you actually have to come round in through the Gentile territory of the Decapolis.
Yeah, you do.
Because you're coming, John is baptizing on the far side of the Jordan.
Yeah, the eastern side. Oh, sorry. Yes, the eastern side.
That's right, the eastern side. Yeah, I always get my east and west muddled up. I don't know. The eastern side. And as you say, there's a lot of resonances there from the Old Testament, isn't there?
There are, because I mean, this is the point where the people of Israel cross over into the Promised Land. It's it's where Moses and Joshua essentially passes on one front to the other. There's the passing on of Elijah and Elisha and so on as well. So these are all stories that are invest this place, this moment, with so much that we can draw on for understanding what Jesus thinks he's doing, and indeed what John thinks he's doing by doing it at that point. So that seems to be very important here.
It is. Now, it's really interesting. You mentioned those two succession narratives. So Moses to Joshua and Elijah to Elisha as well, because actually we see a bit of that dynamic as the reading unfolds as well, don't we here?
Don't we just? Interesting, because I think, there's this passing on of, well, it's interesting that John as in that bit you just read out, seems to be very excited about the baptism of Jesus, i.e., Jesus baptizing.
Yes.
But in fact, when the moment comes, of course, that is completely reversed.
Yes.
And John ends up baptizing Jesus, and in doing that, he's, as it were, passing the mantle on of the story of God through the Old Testament, the story of God's salvation, which is exactly what's happened with Elijah to Elisha, and with Moses to Joshua. And in some ways, I mean, I think, Elisha wants a double portion, doesn't he, when he of Elijah's spirit, and in some ways Joshua achieves more than Moses does in what he does. So there's a kind of almost a lesser to a greater thing going on as well, I think.
Now, we quite often comment on the differences in the accounts within the synoptics, or the connections with the with the fourth gospel as well. And it is very striking here that only Matthew includes this discussion, this exchange, even though it's quite a brief exchange, just a couple of sentences between John and Jesus. I don't know whether, I mean, I've simply observed that this is distinctive of Matthew. I don't know whether you've had any thoughts about why it is that Matthew includes this particularly in his gospel.
I haven't particularly, unless, of course, it really is to emphasize this handing on. I think what's particularly interesting is that Jesus answered him, "Let it be so for now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." The us is really important in that sentence, isn't it? This is about John and Jesus together fulfilling all righteousness. So that seems to point to this transfer, as it were.
It is interesting, and it's not quite what you'd expect either. Almost you'd expect Jesus to say to, well, in response to John's question, I need to be baptized by you, and you come to me.
You'd
almost expect Jesus to say, no, you should do this to fulfill all righteousness, but he doesn't. It is actually a collaborative act.
Absolutely. And that's why I think the us is very, very important to read that there before us.
I thought one of the things that I just dip back into is this language of one coming after me, because the particular word there that Matthew uses is hopisomu, the one that comes after me. And in fact, at times, well, but particularly in the incident where Peter says, Jesus says to the disciples, "Who do people say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ." And then Jesus says, "The Son of Man will be handed over," and so on. And then Peter tries to rebuke him, and he gets a counter rebuke, and he says, "Get behind me, Satan." Everyone thinks that means get out of my way, but actually it means hopisomu, get behind me. That is, fall in line as a disciple. So at first I wondered whether some of these discipleship resonances, in the sense that Jesus is coming to join as a member of this John's eschatological renewal movement, although I suspect actually really the way that John has talked about this is really he's just simply saying Jesus is going to succeed him, he's going to come after him. It's a temporal thing rather than a discipleship term. But it is kind of intriguing, and of course we actually need to look at the fourth gospel, having mentioned that, to notice that the first disciples of Jesus appear to have been people who were originally disciples of John.
They transfer well, I mean, it's not really transfer of allegiance, is it? Because they would see it as consistent. John points to Christ. Why wouldn't you then follow Jesus? Now he's here.
So there's that. And if John is preparing people for the coming kingdom in the person of Jesus, then if people are identifying with this renewal movement through baptism, then of course naturally they'll
then show their loyalty to the King.
And there's also well, it's interesting. You just used the phrase from the lesser to the greater. And actually, John is offering a baptism in water for repentance, and then he says actually there's a greater baptism to come, which is the baptism
Holy Spirit,
purifying the purifying fire of the Spirit. So, and of course, interesting that Jesus doesn't ever baptize anyone in water.
No, exactly. So that's I think that is really quite significant.
And therefore the continuity between the Baptist movement, the John the Baptist movement, and the Jesus movement is that it's Jesus followers who then
baptize.
So that and as far as I'm aware, there are no examples in first century Judaism of people having a one-off baptism. The only antecedent we've got is the repetitive purification in the mikveh. So this this use of baptism as a particular of immersion as a particular sign of a once-off change of direction, I think is a novelty.
Yes, I think we mentioned that when we looked at the earlier passage.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Now we've then got this theological puzzle here, which is the thing that John is wrestling with, which is why, and it is in one sense, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because this is another awkward reality in the Gospels, that if we're saying that Jesus is the very presence of God amongst his people, he is the coming one. We've had all this stuff, particularly Mark's Gospel for Elijah, I'll prepare the way, and John is preparing the way for God to come to his people, and then who actually comes but Jesus. And if John's baptism is a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins, what on earth is Jesus doing being baptized?
Yeah. And of course, there are various answers to that question. I think the one that I find most helpfully convinced is the idea that Jesus is so clearly identifying with those he comes to save, with Israel, that's in so much need of God, that he does it for those terms. That seems to be the way the Old Testament speaks about the one who is to come, and that seems to be, for me, the most convincing approach. It doesn't mean that Jesus is sinful. It means he's identifying with sinful humanity. And that's and I think that's something we can understand, isn't it? I think people we do this in our culture actually quite a lot. People will for instance, modern leaders of countries will apologize for things that have happened in the past that they did not commit that sin. But they are so identified with the country because they're the country's leader that they offer an apology, and that is received as an apology from the country. So it's not an unfamiliar thing for us to do.
Indeed. No. And I think for me, there's two ideas along with that. And this is the whole thing about recapitulation, which of course we've had in Matthew. That is that Jesus is rehearsing the story of Israel. So all those fulfillment quotations in the birth narrative, including most strikingly, the allusion or the quotation from Hosea, "Out of Egypt I called my son," which of course in Hosea is an allusion again to the Exodus narrative. So even though it doesn't actually fit very well theologically, he kind of bolts it on to the fact that they've been to Egypt, and then uses this sort of awkward Old Testament quotation to say, well, there's a sense in which here we can see Jesus rehearsing the story of Israel. And also the fact it's not very obvious means that it's very unlikely that Matthew is sort of concocting these events, because if he was making the events fit the biblical narrative, he would have done it a lot better. But the other dynamic I think for me is that I sometimes hear people talk about Jesus' identification as if the identification itself is redemptive. So people talk about the identification, the incarnation itself as redemptive, where it seems to me that what Matthew does, he says, no, it's a necessary prelude to what's going to happen redemptively, because later on, well, in Matthew 8:17, I mentioned that his ministry fulfills the words from Isaiah 53. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. And that's the way Matthew interprets Jesus' healing ministry. And then, of course, in Matthew 28, which is paralleled in Mark 10:45, that the Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many, as a lutron antipolon. So it seems to me that identification is the necessary preliminary to redemption. It isn't enough on its own, though.
No, I agree. No, I absolutely. I definitely agree with that. And it's also interesting, isn't it, that you're talking about the out of Egypt I've called my son, and of course here is Jesus, as it were, crossing the Jordan to lead the people into the promised land
of forgiveness.
But of course, it's also for Joshua, it was and for the people of Israel, it was the beginning of a serious conflict. And of course, it is true also for Jesus, and Matthew very clearly in what comes after this, with the temptation and so on. It's also very clearly leading us into conflict. So it's both promise and challenge in a sense that's going on here. Yeah.
And I wonder whether that also makes sense of this language of fulfilling all righteousness as well. So actually, again, Jesus is walking the faithful path in obedience to God that Israel failed to do.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't miss the numerological significance of this, because Matthew uses this word righteousness exactly 7 times in his gospel. So I knew you'd be disappointed if I didn't mention that.
Yes, absolutely.
And he doesn't use it in this Pauline sense of, well,
No,
we get into debate about exactly what Paul means, but it is about, in Matthew, it's about doing the right thing.
Yes, fulfilling the commands of God. Yeah,
exactly. And it has that quite clearly Old Testament Jewish sense of, you do what God calls you to, and this is how we live in that kind of obedience.
Yeah.
So then we get to oh gosh, even more Easter eggs coming up. So John, because interesting, I didn't really notice this before. When Jesus says, "It is fitting to fulfill all righteousness," and then John consented.
Yes.
So, you noticed that. Okay, well, kind of begrudgingly. Okay, if you say so, boss.
Yeah.
Now, when I first looked at this passage, I really liked this. I was really struck by this. When Jesus was baptized, immediately he went up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him. There's a couple of interesting things there. One is that in most iconography, it's actually, as it were, Jesus having been submersed into the water, the art interprets it that as his head is breaking out of the water, then the Spirit comes. But actually, I think the most logical way to read that is that he's been baptized and he's now literally climbing out of the river, up the river bank.
Yeah,
and that's when this happens. But I don't know whether that's new to you or whether you think.
Yeah, it was a bit new to me, actually. I hadn't really. The English translations are quite different at this point. I noticed New RSV and NIV are quite different in the way they translate this sentence. So it's not very obvious. But that's an interesting thought. I don't know. What do you make of that? I mean, is it simply that the Spirit is kind of clearly there for Jesus on the move, as it were? This is not just a sort of wonderful spiritual experience, but it's actually about something, much more pragmatic than that. I don't know.
No, I don't know either.
No.
But I'm just looking, and it's interesting here that Matthew is looking quite Markan here, because he uses this word euthus immediately, which is a very characteristic Markan word.
Absolutely.
Immediately.
Yeah.
But it just seems to me that there's a succession of acts. So Jesus, this whole baptism identification thing, and then having done that identification, coming up on the river bank, then you have this stuff with the heavens opening and the Spirit of God descending. I don't know whether that helps to make sense of the very mixed dynamic between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Whereas for Mark, it seems as though it's a personal experience.
Yeah.
Whereas for Luke, it's a very public experience. And Matthew slightly steers a middle course here.
He does.
I think if he'd come up out of the water and was on the riverbank and rejoined the crowds, it would make sense of it being an experience Jesus has, which the crowd just witnessed to. So and of course the wonderful thing I love in the 4th gospel is that John the Baptist says, I saw the Spirit coming on him, the Lamb of God.
Yes.
But he never mentions the baptism. So you have to have read the other gospels
to know that this is what actually
know what on earth he's talking about. We don't even realize that. So now we've got the whole thing about the heavens being split open.
That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I was particularly struck by this phrase because it happens several other times in the New Testament. You think of Stephen, I see heaven opened, and the Son of Man seated at the right hand of God, standing at the right hand of God. And you have it in Peter's dream in Acts 10, and you have it, of course, multiple times in the book of Revelation, as you well know.
Of course.
But of course, every time it happens, it seems to me that what's going on is it's a revelation of a spiritual reality. And so we're getting a glimpse into something profoundly true, which we would call spiritual truth.
It is. And I would also know that it's actually, you mentioned Revelation. This is apocalyptic language.
Yeah.
And this is language, now bother, I haven't got the reference in Isaiah. This relates to, and actually in the other Gospels even more explicitly, to this verse in Isaiah, which says, oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down.
That's right.
So you're in the transition in the Old Testament from the prophetic to the more obviously apocalyptic. And again, that reminds us that this is the whole language of the kingdom of God is about apocalyptic eschatology. So we need to realize that. But then you've also got the whole thing about the Spirit of God coming, the dove, voices from heaven, and there's the whole series of Old Testament allusions here, aren't there?
Yes, and I think the dove is once again it's very much related to the heaven being torn open, because it's in bodily form and all that, or as I think it's Luke who tells us that. But the dove descending is also a sign on earth of what is true, I think, already in heaven. So the Spirit is already on Jesus. We know that. It's not as if this is the first time he's encountered the Spirit by any means at all. But it's just telling us what is already true, which is that the Spirit is with Jesus.
Yeah. So
that it's echoing the reality in heaven. That's how it seems to me to work. And I think that's true in that obviously Noah is, I think you mentioned this on the blog, has all these elements in it. Has somebody in the water, floating on the water. Heaven is opened, and this dove that comes. And the dove is that the heaven is in Noah's, of course, is a symbol of God's judgment. The dove appearing is actually a symbol of God's mercy and God's grace, isn't it?
Yeah, the judgment is now done, and now the
judgment is now done. So you're getting these realities being shown in a very physical way, really.
And then you get the voice from heaven, and again multiple allusions here. This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased. And you really can't again avoid hearing Genesis 22:2, where God says to Abraham, "Take your son, your only son, your beloved son." So you have that allusion to sacrificial offering. And then the other is that the one in whom I delight is from the
in Isaiah.
In Isaiah 42.
The continuity with the promise to Abraham, I think, is particularly powerful resonance for me. That in a sense, the whole of the Old Testament is really about how God is going to fulfill the promise to Abraham, that in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And this is the ultimate outworking of it.
And we do get those allusions to Abraham as well through Matthew. So I mean, I'm just immediately thinking of Matthew 7. Many will come from the east and west and sit at the feast with Abraham. And then the last sort of, I think, major set of allusions is to Ezekiel, beginning of Ezekiel. Again, Ezekiel stands by a river. The heavens are opened. He sees a vision of God in which he's commissioned. Ezekiel himself is commissioned for prophetic ministry. And of course, the whole reason for, again, Ezekiel's ministry is because the glory has departed, the people are in exile, and yet this is not the end, and the hope is not fully extinguished, and that actually God goes with his people, but he does that in order to develop this vision of the restoration of people. Now, again, that connects with Tom Wright's slightly controversial proposal that the way that Jews saw themselves in the first century was that they'd never really come back from exile. And I think John Barclay replies, yes, that's a very good illustration if it weren't for the fact that not a single piece of Jewish literature actually says that, uses that language. But it's a kind of theological way of packaging the frustrations and the desires of, as we find in Zechariah's song in the Benedictus, that they still are not a people who are free to worship God in holiness and righteousness, because they're still oppressed by their enemies. And of course, the key question is, who is the enemy?
And I think Tom Wright, points to the fact that the glory has never returned to the temple, doesn't it? I mean, that's his sort of major point. But absolutely, it's not something which is particularly commented on. Well, there we are. We're moving the transition from Christmas to Epiphany, and we found a whole load of Easter eggs. Yes. I just finished by, I just love the comment from Dick France in his commentary on this passage, which is Dick's New International Commentary on Matthew is just a fantastic resource. Yeah, brilliant. And he says this: God is not quoting the Old Testament, nor setting a puzzle for the scripturally erudite hearers to unravel. He's declaring in richly elusive language that this man, who has just been baptized by John, is his own son in whom he delights. From this point on, Matthew's readers have no excuse for failing to understand the significance of Jesus' ministry, however long it may take the actors in the story to reach the same Christological conclusion. Very good. There we go, friends. No, James, we forgot to ask people to do all those things that they're supposed to do. Yes. Well, now we can. Yes, I mean, if you can help us out, if you just like these videos or subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed already. Down here's a little button, subscribe. Yes. Do share it on social media and do comment on it, please, as well, because we have some really fascinating comments. Yeah. We'd love to interact with you that way.
Do you like Easter eggs? Have you spotted them? Are there any others we've missed? And all those kinds of questions. That's great. Friends, thanks very much for joining us. James, lovely to see you, and look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.